And good morning, everybody. We're live. Congratulations. You made it through the week. Another week of food safety, food quality, amazing products, feeding the nation, keeping people safe. And a lot of times in what we do in food safety and quality assurance, it goes unheralded because people just assume it happens. But we realize that that's not the case. So Kurt and I this morning wanted to say thanks because we really appreciate all that you do to keep our food safety the way that it is. If you're new to the chat, welcome, pull up a chair. We're going to talk here for about an hour on a food safety topic. My name is Brian Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. And every week I bring an amazing guest on our chat and we have a conversation around food safety. And that's a key point to remember in this conversation is it's not a lecture. This is meant to be an interactive discussion. And we love to answer questions around what it is and what's going on out there in the world. So please type in your questions as we're going along and we'll weave them into the discussion as we can. So one of the things that we love to do here on the chat is put in where in the world you are at. And today I'm at my house in beautiful Loveland, Colorado, where it's going to be approximately 75 degrees today. So spring has definitely arrived here. And if you have been in the food industry for any period of time, you know the gentleman who's joining me today for the chat. This is Kurt Westmoreland, and he is the Chief Commercial Officer of FlexXray Foreign Material Inspection Services. Good morning, Kurt. How you doing?
Doing great, Brian. Thank you. It's not often I'm introduced as an amazing guest, but hey, I'm gonna take it while I can get it. So I appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. So it looks like you're at home as well, Kurt. Where are you at?
So I live in a little small town called Cleveland, Georgia, about an hour and a half north of Atlanta. So work out of the home office a lot when I'm not traveling, or at the corporate office out in Arlington, Texas.
Nice. And so Stephanie's hitting it off to bat. So Stephanie, good morning. Well, I guess good afternoon for you. Stephanie's over in beautiful Germany, and I know she recently had a holiday, so hopefully everything went well for Stephanie on her vacation as well. So with that, oh my goodness, we have so much stuff to get into. So if you didn't catch it, oh gosh, Kurt, I almost did it. I almost went too far. Everybody, before we get started, this is how anxious I am. Join Kurt and I for a drink of your favorite beverage. I have coffee. What do you got today, Kurt? Coffee?
I've got the Diet Coke. I'm not a coffee guy, so.
Yeah. Well, Georgia's a good place for Coke. Cheers. Very nice. So with that, Kurt and I recently were involved in a webinar that FlexXray put on around foreign material. And I was one of the guests with two other guests from Tyson and was it Hormel? Is that correct?
Yeah, Hormel. Yeah.
And I learned a ton. And anytime, you know this from me, is anytime I can learn something new, it's a total win. And I picked up so many new things from those guys on that chat. It was an amazing chat. At the end of this presentation here today of what we're going through, I'm going to put the link to the YouTube video that FlexXray put up on our presentation. Check it out. It's if you want some good insights onto foreign material and management and validation and how this gets into your food safety culture, it was a great conversation.
Yeah, and Brian, one of the things that was I found to be really interesting through that webinar is, in the comments section, a lot of the persons who were attending the webinar were asking questions as we went along, which was great. It was also really nice to see the attendees answering each other's questions.
Yeah,
there was a lot of interaction going on, and that was really cool because you could see that people were engaged and understanding. It really gave us a lot of stuff to talk toward during the webinar. So. A little hint there, guys. If you guys see questions out there and you want to drop some responses in there, it'll give Brian and I something to refer to as we talk here.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the key lessons in what we do is you don't have to know everything. A lot of times we feel like we have to have all that knowledge, but there's so many people out there who are just amazing experts. And if you're going to succeed in food safety and quality assurance at food manufacturing companies, your network is extremely important because I have those contacts, people like Kurt and other people, lawyers, food law, things like this, that I can call at any given time and ask them questions to help me out. Why struggle by yourself? So building out that network and being here for sharing of knowledge like this is the perfect place to do this because food safety is not a point of competition. So we'll kind of dive into our topic here for today, which is really an extension of what we talked about last week on the webinar. In that, one of the biggest challenges, Kurt, for quality professionals, and I went through this all the time, and it would just drive me nuts. I would come into my office. And so the example I always think of relative to this, I was running food safety and quality for a company, and I had an office in one of our plants, and I'd spend a lot of my time there, which was great. I would come in the morning. There would be a Whirlpack bag sitting on my desk with a gasket, with about this much of the gasket, right? You know where I'm going. And a big chunk of that gasket missing. And a note from the sanitation manager saying, "Hey, Brian, we found this in a strainer on line 2 during sanitation." I'm like, ugh, okay. So now I got to wake the poor sanitation guy up, who just spent the entire night with his crew working like dogs cleaning the plant. And I just would feel awful about it every time I did it. And I'd say, "Hey, Dave, you know that gasket you put on my desk?" "Yeah." "Where's the rest of it?" "Well, it could be here and here and here and here. It could be that it broke during production, and it could have got in product if it went this way, et cetera, et cetera." It's like, okay, that doesn't help very much. And then I would go up to the plant manager and brief him on what was going on. And he would always say this toward the end of the conversation: "Okay, well, Brian, yeah, odds are that gasket's not in the product. It's probably in a strainer somewhere, and we'll find it later. What do you want to do? Do you want to put the product on hold and short all the customers, or do you want to release it?" Neither of those. Don't like either of those options. And in the beginning, I would run off like an idiot and try and solve that problem and get the product out the door and act the hero and firefight and all that stuff. It took me a while to realize and figure out that failure wasn't a quality failure. It was a production operations maintenance failure. They weren't maintaining their gaskets. They weren't following proper PM. They weren't doing good inspection at the beginning of the line startup, all these type of things. And once I changed my mindset around that and realized that their failures need to be investigated by them, and I will then judge whether or not it's effective or not, is the proper way to handle it. And just that slight shift in how I approach things made all the difference.
Yeah, and that's the response to those kind of challenges and those kind of issues is really what we do here at FlexXray, and it's and it's we hear often, we really don't like to have to talk to you guys, but when we do talk to you guys, we love working with you because you do a nice job for us.
Yeah.
And what you're describing there is what we call on our side of the business, and we call it an episodic event. And a lot of what we do is driven by those episodes. And the reality is many of them are unpreventable. And so it's really all about, once it happens, how do you respond to it? What are the things that you're going to do to try to remediate it, to really try to keep product in commerce? And that's a perfect example. They're asking you, what are you going to do? Well, obviously, you want to keep product out of the landfill. You want to keep product in commerce, and you want to reduce food waste, and you want to save the dollars associated with it. So, what are your options there?
Yeah, exactly. And after our webinar, Kurt, I got thinking about stuff. And the investigation piece of it's all well and good. If I have a chunk of that gasket that's missing, that's pretty, hey, I got a problem, I got to go fix it. But a lot of times you may not necessarily know if you have a problem. And that's really kind of what I wanted to talk about here today. And it all started with an article from Food Safety Magazine from a few years ago by a gentleman named Richard Steyer, Stier, who was talking about exactly what we're talking about here. And so I wanted to pull that article up and kind of, at least look at this. So he was talking about control and evaluation of foreign material and food. And what he's going in this article, and I'll put this link in here as well, guys, is poor manufacturing practice. So a lot of times we hear in the documentation, we'll go into this with the regulations here a little bit as well, is FDA's rules around adulteration involving hard or sharp foreign objects. And a lot of times, Kurt, plants will read this, and the quality manager will read this and say, oh, well, FDA has set up limits of around, 7 millimeters to 28 millimeters. And inside of that range is the food safety risk. And anything smaller than that should be okay. Anything bigger than that, people shouldn't eat. So I'm cool. And that's not true. It's not true. What do you think of people what do you say to people who tell you that?
Well, if you, I guess clearly by the letter of the law or the reg or whatever you want to call it. There is some area there to take that approach. But the reality is if you even below the 7 millimeters, significantly below the 7 millimeters, while it may not be something that's regulated, and it may not be something that might be inherently dangerous depending on the who the product's going to and what the contaminant may be, it does create quality issues. And I know that a lot of people who are attending our chat today, and a lot of folks in the industry, they're just like you've got microbiological, chemical, physical specs on product. There are specifications in products around foreign materials. What down to what size you can have, or can you have none, that kind of thing. And so, if you look at it from the standpoint of anything between 7 and 25 is fine, maybe from that perspective, but from the perspective of your customer and really the end user, the end customer that eats the product down the chain, it's there's some concerns there from a quality perspective.
Exactly. And this always gets back to defining our terms, and always going back to the reference material that FDA would be looking at a potential issue. And within that is the two things that always comes back to under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that's adulteration and misbranding. So misbranding, having a label claim that isn't true, misbranding. Adulteration, things in the product that are not food, and that's foreign material. And you cannot get around that. If FDA labels your product as adulterated, game over. That's it. But, and I think you said some really important things there in what your comments, Kurt, relative to those guidelines. Number one, the most important is your target audience. So if you are selling products to small children, is any foreign material acceptable? No, it's not. And FDA is going to look at it that way. And the other point that you made in this as well is there's food safety and food quality decisions that are taking place here as well. Because we know as consumers ourselves, do we want to find foreign material in our products? Hell no. It's gross and it shouldn't be there. So a lot of times with foreign material recalls, people recall it regardless of what FDA stance are relative to that product.
Yeah, because you just don't want that floating around out there. You don't want the social media posts that are hitting, hey, we found chunks of metal in product X. The damage to the brand is a big deal when it comes to foreign materials, because as we all know, people post a lot of stuff today on social media, and a lot of information gets out there, and a lot of times it may be misrepresented to be worse than what it is in terms of them finding something in a product.
Right. It's always, and that's a good point, it's always a good tactic. Anything that you read in the media, be skeptical. I saw a story here just a couple of days ago where they were looking at this type of an issue, and they had some quotes in the article from Dr. Darren Detweiler, and it said in there, ex-FDA employee or something along that line. It's like, no, he's not, right? So he just like the rest of us, right? We work with FDA, but he was never employed by them. To have that big of an error in the opening paragraph from the article tells you a lot about the article.
Well, you lose a lot of credibility, especially for the people that know.
Yeah, exactly. So with that, right, we have adulteration is the thing that we're worried about here. And what's very interesting as well is what FDA refers to as defect action levels. So if you're looking at CFR 21, 110, 110, they also talk, Kurt, about natural or unavoidable foreign material. So they recognize that there's some things that are inherent in products that are not edible, but are considered foreign material. So for example, olive pits or something like this would be an inherent foreign material. What's interesting on those type of points, though, is that's not a get out of jail free card. If you buy olives and it says on the label pitted, you have to remove the pits. So even in those circumstances that it's a naturally occurring foreign material present inherent in the product, if you're claiming that you removed it, you still have to remove it, which is why a lot of times you'll see on those labels, warning may still contain slight fragments or things of this nature. That's kind of the lawyerese piece of it, right?
Yeah, because I mean, those things are difficult, and it's when you're getting into those products, and you're trying to do the right things, but it doesn't always happen. And when we've heard that one, quite often, the pits and olives, or when in peaches and those kind of things where they can be a challenge, and they are difficult to remove. I think another example of that too is when you're looking at boneless chicken. The
Mhm.
the idea is you're supposed to have boneless chicken. So, what does that mean? Well, to the consumer, it means it's boneless. And it doesn't mean that you're going to find small slivers or small pieces and those kind of things, which we know, coming out of the industry, is very difficult to get all of those small slivers and small pieces out during the deboning process.
Yeah, the marketing people wouldn't like the name mostly boneless chicken. I don't think
There
that
you
would
go.
that would
That
go
makes
too
it
well.
difficult. It makes it difficult. Yeah.
And so it's interesting, as I was looking through preparing for this chat as well, is with these defect action levels, FDA has defined certain types of products that have these defects. And by default, they don't define everything. So
Mhm.
they're saying two things in here, which I think are really important, Kurt, is that if we've defined defect action levels relative to your product, we're going to be evaluating against those. However, that doesn't give you a get out of jail free card. You still need to control your hazards. And if it's not defined, it's assumed that you control them. So if there's no defect action levels associated with, say, like cheese, that means FDA is saying that, no, we're not saying that there's nothing that you need to do. We're saying that you have to do everything. So in that standard, FDA is essentially operating off a negative, saying if we don't talk about you, that means you need to control your foreign material.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's and I think that's what you've seen a lot now, in the food industry, with the addition of X-ray machine into food manufacturing environments, outside of just metal detectors. Yeah, in the past, we know the metal detectors have kind of been the standard, and in many cases, the metal detector is a critical control point in a HACCP plan. But over the last few years, especially in the couple 3 years that I've been here at FlexRay, we've seen companies start to add more and more inline X-ray capabilities into their process, and I think it's for that purpose. It's because there's become more and more scrutiny on what's going on in terms of foreign materials, and metal detectors are good for what they detect, and they're detecting metal. But how are you detecting all these other potential foreign materials that might get into your product?
Exactly. And it always is worth reiterating every year in and out, recall. There's always the top three for recalls: pathogens, so Listeria and Salmonella,
Hmm.
allergens,
Allergens.
and foreign material
Yeah.
every single year.
Yeah.
And we need to, and we see these criticisms in the marketplace, Kurt, where, different trade groups are out there writing articles about the food industry saying, what's the problem? Why can't we get these down? Why do we keep having these issues? And they kind of have a point.
Yeah, they do. But again, it's kind of like we were talking about earlier with the pits and olives and those kind of things. I mean, it's difficult as much as a company tries. It's difficult for a company to be perfect with a process,
Right.
and so really it's all about you risk evaluation of the process and the kind of things that you can do from a risk mitigation and a risk management standpoint, within a process. And I'll give you an example of that. You brought up gaskets very early on here in our conversation, and we know that you've got bad gaskets, you got medium quality gaskets, and you got really strong, really good gaskets, and they cost. The really strong, really good gaskets cost a bit more than the cheaper, weaker gaskets. And what we've seen going on in the marketplace of some of our customers is, they're doing some internal evaluations of those kind of things that go into their equipment. Gaskets being a perfect example. And what they're looking at is, can these gaskets, if and when they break, can the gaskets be detected via inline X-ray machine or a third-party X-ray machine? And it may be that they're not able to be detected by an inline X-ray machine, but they may be able to be detected by, the work that we're doing at FlexRay. And what they're doing is they're starting to work with their maintenance departments as they go through and do their routine preventive maintenance work. They're starting to trade out gaskets and getting rid of the weaker, older ones, putting the better gaskets in, and their gaskets they've really done some evaluation with us on, where they can say, look, these things are probably at some point in time going to get brittle. They're probably going to crack. There's something going to end up in the product. If it gets there, we want to know that it can be detected via X-ray technology so that we can recover as much product as we can. What we don't want is a really brittle gasket being out into the product. And now you're in a situation where you can't detect it either in line or you can't detect it via third party. And now you're in a real pickle with what to do with the product.
Exactly. And part of this, and I think what plants need to start doing is a lot of times, Kurt, you'll see this in plants, is the maintenance department will buy gaskets in bulk, and they'll buy one type of gasket and they'll put it everywhere. To your point, well, what's the cheapest gasket I can find? Let's just buy a whole bunch of those. And really what you need to start doing is looking at your plant and doing a risk assessment for these type of gaskets. So preventive maintenance programs have gotten extremely sophisticated, and you can track gasket wear by location. You should do that. And you also need to look at it by ease of changeability, I think, for lack of a better word. So for example, if you're out on the production floor and you look up and there's 3-inch transfer lines that are running along the ceiling, and you can see where the clamps are and you can see where those gaskets are. Yeah. Just look at it from a common sense standpoint. If I'm a maintenance guy, do I really want to get on the scissor lift and change those guys out if I don't have to? No, they're going to leave them alone. Look at the lines that's hammer, right? So sometimes you'll get back pressure or things less than lines, and you'll see these lines, right? Yeah. Those gaskets are taking a beating when that goes on. You need to look at that. And also don't forget with these gaskets, you can also think of this in terms of just not foreign material, but also food safety. Poor quality gaskets, are they harborage? Are they allowing bacteria to grab on and start producing biofilm and contaminating your product at that point? There's all kinds of good reasons for having these type of programs. There's also, to your point, there are metal detectable gaskets where they put metal in the gaskets so that if it does get into the product, your metal detector will hopefully find it and kick it off.
Yeah, and that's one of the other alternatives that we've seen some of our customers doing. And the thing with that is, if you're utilizing, like to your point, the metal detectable gasket, while even if you get down to a really small piece of the gasket, and maybe the metal detector misses it because it's so small. When you start looking at third party X-ray technology and how small we can find really small pieces of metal, it makes it easier in that situation. Again, while you may not be able to find just the gasket or the rubber gasket, a metal detectable gasket's got embedded metal in it. It may be easier to find from a technology standpoint.
Right. The whole purpose of this is just like everything else in your food safety programs. How can I efficiently segregate and isolate products so that I have the minimum amount of risk associated with that? So with that, so number one, CIP to CIP is always your primary borders associated with production, and also then rework. You're always looking at those. But for foreign material, I think, Kurt, you need to evaluate these things separately. And a lot of times it's an afterthought. So go through your plant, and let's use a dairy example here again. It's one I'm most familiar with. Is you're bringing in raw milk into the plant. You know that there's foreign material in that raw milk it's a farm, right? Hay, straw, whatever gets into that raw milk. Yeah. What are the filters that are removing that? What are the filters that are on the truck when they're pulling it out of the bulk tank into the receiving truck to bring to your plant? When you hook that raw milk up to your plant, what inline filters do you have? Now, dairy plants have milk filters right there at that plant. Who's looking at those, right? What is your bio load coming into the plant relative to those products? It's going to vary by time of year. If it's in the winter and the cows are all inside and they're being fed silage or grain or things like this, you're probably going to have less. If the cows are out running around in the fields in the summer and getting into all kinds of crazy stuff, different other types of foreign material can get in that. How effective are those at getting that out? And looking at those filters, just don't let the guys clean it off and put it back in. You need to, okay, what's our level with this? That's our primary defense for stuff coming in the plant. What are those other things in the plant that are natural barriers to foreign material? Your homogenizer, extremely high pressure device meant to break up the fat globules in the milk with teeny tiny little apertures for the product to get through. Number one, you want to protect that equipment and have filters ahead of time so you don't damage it, but nothing's getting through that. So that's another barrier. Yeah. If you have fluid milk fillers, You have screens on the very end of those before you're dispensing into the containers. Are those screens intact? What are those different steps in your process that are there to help prevent foreign material physically within your process?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point there, Brian. And a lot of the folks on this call may know this, but there's one of the one of the really large retailers, in the U.S. A few months ago, released a standard that basically required that suppliers have inline X-ray systems, or you have to have things that would provide the same level of detection as having an inline X-ray system, i.e., sieve screens and those kind of things. But if you're utilizing sieve screens and those kind of things in lieu of an X-ray, you've got to have you've got to have done the risk analysis, and you have to have the data to show that your process is as effective as utilizing an X-ray machine.
Yeah.
And to your point, it's not just having them in place, and it's not just having them there to do the job. How do you measure what they're doing? How do you evaluate their effectiveness? Who's in charge of that? How does it fit into the process? And while it may not be a part of the HACCP program, it's got to be some way involved in the risk management and the risk associate or the risk assessment of what's going on in the facility.
Very good point. So in your production facility, there's equipment that's going to naturally wear. Anytime you have metal on metal, right, you're going to have particles that could potentially be produced. If you have Teflon coatings on pieces of equipment to keep things from sticking, or if you have vats with Teflon scrapers, right, that are going around outside on the vat, they have tiny little cotter pins that hold those suckers in. How do I know that? Ask me out some other time how I know that. And keeping track of all that stuff. Anytime, this is something else that you need to be doing is in that validation process, which I think is huge and people don't think about too much. Where are those sources of wear and how are those being controlled? Where are those areas where the potential for foreign material is directly in contact with the product? So think of like a packaging machine, and you have product going down a belt, and it's sitting there on that belt. There's all kinds of stuff above it and guards and everything else. But if you kind of go like this and look up inside, what is directly above that product? And a lot of times what you'll find are zip ties and wires and teeny little screws and other things like this that can fall in the product. Yeah. If they have the potential to fall into the product, you need to track those things. That needs to be part of your morning setup. So what I would do in my plants is we would buy line, and this was the operator's responsibility. For those exposure areas, we had a list of everything that could fall off or could become damaged. And they had to check and make sure that all of those things were in place before the run. Again, we are just like CIP to CIP. We were for foreign material, blocking it by production run. And the example I would use in this, Kurt, is we've all seen this. Anybody who's in a production facility sees this all the time. Is those nice plexiglass shields that we build and put around our machines. You know exactly where I'm going with this. And we're doing the right thing. We're protecting the operators from sticking their hand in somewhere where they shouldn't stick it in and maybe being injured. And we're keeping that product separated from the environment. But those operators are going in those machines all day long, checking settings or adjusting product or whatever they need to do. Open, close, open, close, open, close. Yeah. And those weak points where the maintenance guys have set up hinges, crack, and they break. And there's nothing more embarrassing, Kurt, than going through a production facility with FDA or the state or whoever, and they will zone in on them suckers every single time and go, Mr. Armentrout, can I show you something? Sure. What do you got? This guard on this machine. Yeah. I see that part of the plexiglass is missing.
Yeah, there's a missing chunk.
It is. Where is it?
Yeah.
And then you got to kind of do do a dance to try and get out of that and say, I don't know where that is. Back to your point, Kurt, is the X-ray going to check that? Maybe. Depends on density. Is the metal detector going to catch it? No way. Yeah. Metal detector's going to catch it. So you could be in a lot of problems.
Yeah, and I think a key point you make there is you're checking that at certain periods of time, and you're looking at different things, and i.e., you're bracketing the product. And the thing about it, and I think it's key for anyone, when you're putting these form material programs in place, these bracketing processes or the bracketing system that you're using, how much product gets bracketed at a certain period of time, is certainly key. Because in the event, in that case, you've got this clear shield, and you think it might have gotten in the product, you know, you'd much prefer it be bracketed in 50,000 pounds of product than 500,000 pounds of product. So now you're dealing with a much, much smaller issue. And how do you look at it? And to your point, I mean, clear plexiglass is hard to find. I mean, like almost impossible to find, even with a third party x-ray, because the density is just not there. And it's just very, very hard to find. And, and so when that happens, you get the, the less you can limit the amount of product involved, the better off you are. And the thing that you mentioned that with that thing breaking and people touching it, one of the things that I think is so important when you're thinking in terms of foreign material, and I know food safety culture is a bit of a buzzword right now, and I don't use it as a buzzword. I use it as a reality of what's going on in food safety. In our we have to encourage our employees to be open, to be honest, and be willing to have conversations with their management when things happen, because they do. For example, if you've got safety glasses that get into product and drop into product, safety glasses, are inherently very, 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 have very little density to them at all. They're hard to find. They're hard to see. They get in product, they get ground up, and now you've got a real issue. And the last thing you want is an employee where that might happen, afraid to tell their management that it's in the product, that they dropped it in the product because of fear of losing a job or something like that. And I think as we go through the training of employees, having those kind of conversations up front and encouraging employees to let us know when something might occur, because as management or as line supervisors or whatever, you may not know. You're not going to know a lot of times until the end of the shift, where you find something on the checklist that's missing, or unless you've got an employee that's willing to come and tell you early on in the process.
Yep. And worst case scenario, your consumers tell you about it. I one time I had a wallet, a full wallet, ID and everything, returned to us from a customer.
Well, that maybe that's where we found the $50 bill in a product. So we actually did find a $50 bill, a folded up $50 bill on top of a frozen block of product. So it's things get there. It's just a matter of how people are notified and what happens.
Exactly. But what you're talking about there overall is extremely important, right? So as we talk about on the chat a lot, GMPs, a lot of times, Kurt, we want to get fancy in what we do and talk about, these newest research papers on risk assessments for Bacillus cereus or whatever it is, and learn about all this knowledge about what's going on. And we forget about the basics. If you want a successful plant, if you want to have good customer complaints, all of these type of things all ties back to your GMPs. That's why when FDA visits your plant and they're out on the floor, they spend a whole lot of time looking at employee practices, because that's the window into how you're managing your plant. And that blocking and tackling is so important. If any people are listening to this who are quality managers in plants, I want you to do something today. If you're at work, go out on the floor and just watch and look around. Are there discarded gloves laying on the floor? Are there other pieces of wrapping paper or other things that are just in the production process of being busy that could potentially get in the product? What are those things? Because a lot of times, and we talk about this on the chat quite a bit too, Kurt, is in production facilities, if you're the quality manager and you've been working there for 5 years, you're doing this. Right? There's things going on that you don't see. You come in the morning, you park your car, you get your coffee, you head to your office, and you start doing your work. And there's a routine you follow. You're not getting out there and stepping back. And this is why a lot of times having somebody like me or Kurt or somebody just coming into your plant and looking around with fresh eyes, we'll look at things that you walk by every day that you don't even notice. We'll be like, hey, what is that pipe up there wrapped with duct tape?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. You're right. The maintenance guy did that, and the longer that goes with that pause, the longer the time that's been
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
And
it's uncanny how often that that happens, and over the years I've had the opportunity to be in a lot of different food plants, from produce to chocolate, and everything in between,
yep,
and the things that you see, to your point, is you can walk in as an outside third party, and you're just taking a look at what's going on and watching the process, and it just immediately kind of jumps out. And you're like, what in the world is going on here? But it's been in place for a while. And to your
yeah,
point, you get blinders around it and you don't see it. And it's not that anybody is doing anything intentional. It's just it's become a part of the process.
yeah.
But with having that third party able to go in and take a look at it, you immediately start to identify some things to help improve what's going on in the process.
Yep. And the example to help people understand this that I use is a magician. A magician will do sleight of hand. They'll have a coin, and also, where'd it go? Right? And everybody's like, "Oh my god!" Right? Little, and it's because they are manipulating your focus. Look over here. Look over here. But the action's really taking place over here. And it's a good example of how the human mind works. We think we're seeing this when we're walking around. No,
Mhm.
our brains do not have the ability to process that amount of information. We are focused on one
Yeah.
small little area that's constantly moving, and our brain is integrating this information. But that's our focus. And if you understand
Yeah.
that and actually apply it, things change dramatically.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So
And
the
it's
other
not,
key
when you
thing,
think about it, it's not, you're bringing in a consultant to tell you everything you're doing wrong, and you don't want to only bring a consultant in, in a time of crisis or in our world during an episode. There's a lot of value in having folks come in, and it may not be an outside paid consultant. It may be maybe a territory sales manager for FlexXray, or for your laboratory, or for whoever that you're doing work with, that's grown up in the food industry, been in the food industry, and it's just part of a walkthrough where they're getting to
yeah,
know and learn and understand your business better. It's just part of building that that relationship with your supplier, with a vendor, and talking through what your product and your process is all about. Even that set of eyes can often lend a lot of value to what's going on in terms of evaluating your process.
exactly. And I think, Kurt, that's a really good point, because this kind of falls under that category of what we strive for in food safety, which is we don't want to be living in the corrective action world, right? We had a problem, let's fix it, and all right, we'll train people, and hopefully that won't happen again.
Hmm.
We want to get to the preventive side of things, right?
Hmm.
What could happen, and how can we keep these things from happening? And if it does happen, who can we reach out to help us with this? The time to find a company who can inspect and look for foreign material in your product is not while it's happening, it's before it happens. So you want to be able to set up that relationship. Same with having a good food lawyer. Having a
Yeah.
good food lawyer is incredibly important. Being able to reach out to experts in the industry like Dr. Marshall at Eurofins
Yeah.
and say, hey, Dr. Marshall, I make these type of products. Is there anything I should be thinking about that I haven't thought about? Just having those relationships, because if there's a crisis, you need to be able to pick up that phone and say, hey, Kurt, we've got a potential foreign material issue. Can you help us out? Right? You
Yeah.
don't want the conversation to be, I'm sorry, who are you?
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, Brian, that's a great point, because, having been, with FlexXray now for, a little over 2 years, one of the things that I continue to see and find out is, there are still a lot of people in the food industry that don't know that a third party X-ray inspection service exists.
Yeah.
It's because it's somewhat new to the industry, and the approach and looking at it is somewhat new to the industry. And the more we're out there doing these kind of things and having conversations with people in the industry, we're helping to build that understanding and those relationships. But to your point, one of the key things that that we've seen people start to do and get ahead of the curve, I guess, is a good way to think about it from what you're saying, is not waiting until an episode occurs to determine if a particular contaminant might be able to be found within a particular type of product matrix. because the way the process works is very much like you're doing any kind of science work or any kind of test or whatever you're doing. First thing you got to do is you got to verify or validate that the process is going to work for the on the product and or contaminant at hand. And so if somebody comes to us, and you've mentioned cheese a few times, and says, hey, I've got a block of cheese and we think that there's a piece of a rubber gasket that's gotten into our product. We don't know how much it is. We don't know where it is. This is the type of rubber gasket we got. What do we do? Well, we ask for them to send us a sample of the cheese. If they have it, a sample of the rubber gasket. If not, we've got some in-house seeds that we can use, and we'll break that rubber gasket down to as small a piece as we can possibly find going through the third-party X-ray system. And then we tell them, yeah, we can find this with 99% repeatability. Let's get the trucks on the road, and we're going to help you save product. There may be a time, though, when we look at it and say, we can't find this at 99% repeatability. We can find it at 88%, which is still pretty doggone good. And so depending on who the final customer is, what the quality parameters around the product are, now you can make a risk-based decision. Do we still want to go forward with the project, or are we going to pull the plug on it? Right. But to your point, is instead of having to wait until an episode occurs, one of the things that we're starting to see people do is we're calling them portfolio builds, and they'll say, hey, these are the top 10 SKUs that we're manufacturing, and these are the top 8 or 10 contaminants that we typically will see in our processing environment. And we'll get the products in, we'll go through the whole testing process, and we'll essentially build a database or a portfolio build of the top 10 SKUs and the top 10 or so contaminants. So God forbid there is an episode, but if they have an issue, now they don't have to take the time to send a block of cheese, to send the rubber gasket. Now they've built that database, and they can make a call and say, hey, Kurt, we got this block of cheese with this contaminant, and we're able to say, yay, it's in your database. And then the fact that it's in your database, we can go ahead and get trucks on the road now versus delaying a day or two and going through the testing process and shipping things back and forward. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, and even not to mention just the basic blocking and tackling of doing business with other companies. So if somebody contacts you out of the blue, say, okay, here's what we can kind of do in the meantime, but we also need to set you up as a client. And all these that all takes time, right? Time that you don't have when you got that product on hold and you're shorting customers. Do that work in advance.
Absolutely.
I think, too, Kurt, you made a really good point here, because we're talking food safety, and mostly to your point earlier in our conversation, we think micro, right? But foreign material, number 3, right? Number 3 again, in that you need to validate your process. What type of foreign material, to your point, which is a great one, I want to reiterate that, is what type of foreign material do we get? And we've talked about some here, right? So Teflon, metal, gaskets, glass, whatever it is within your particular process. The other piece of this is change management. So engineering wants to buy a new piece of equipment. Oh, wait, it's not actually a new piece of equipment. It's a used one that they found at an auction. Right? So immediately, as a food safety person, your ears go up, and you're like, okay, well, where'd this machine come from? What type of allergens are in it, or things like this? The other questions you should be asking is, what are the foreign material threats from this piece of machinery? You're introducing a new variable into your process. Was this machine taken care of? What type of PMs were done? What are the risks of failure with this particular piece of equipment? And validating that within your process so that you understand that. And again, this is where working with your maintenance team is so critical, and building that into the PM. So when anytime maintenance brings in a new piece of equipment, they're going to set up a predictive maintenance schedule associated with it. And the things that are going on with AI in this space, crazy, absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
So they need to understand that.
Yeah, the AI piece is starting to really blow up, and it's going to take a little bit of time for it to get to where it truly needs to be, because of all the different types of products and matrices and contaminants that are out there. But I think eventually it's going to be something that's going to be a real benefit. Yeah, but along those same lines, though, when you're talking about maintenance and looking at equipment and that kind of thing, one of the things I think is important is, as a customer, as you're looking at suppliers, or as a manufacturer, you're looking at co-manufacturers. As part of your due diligence, of looking at new suppliers, new co-manufacturers, and those kind of things. You have specifications, and typically your specifications, I think I mentioned this earlier, tied to microbiological, chemical, physical, whatever they may be. But as part of that due diligence of looking at new suppliers or new partners to manufacture your product, does it make sense to now start building some type of evaluation of the foreign material program,
Mm.
into that due diligence? And that may be that you're looking at their internal processes, their internal records, their internal, in-line machines, whether it be, metal or X-ray. But it also may mean that, just like you may have samples sent in for actual laboratory type tests to evaluate the product. Maybe you send in, a few pallets of product, to be evaluated for foreign material to get a baseline or get an understanding for what's going on in the process. And like you said, you got pathogens, you got allergens, and you got foreign materials. And one of the ways that you get ahead of that is to start doing some of these proactive programs when you're looking at, the introduction of a new supplier or a new co-man.
Yep. And as Cortland says here too, how can AI be used without validation? Answer to that, can't, right? So it's just another tool. It has to understand what we're asking it to do, just like anybody
Exactly
else.
Right. Exactly.
So it's only as good as the input that we get into it. Another important piece to remember around this too, relative to foreign material contamination in your product is, as we talked about, is your target audience and what your levels are relative to that. But also going back to adulteration, never forget that you cannot, if you have an adulterant in your product, it cannot be diluted away. You can't say, nah, if we just have a bigger lot of product, it's, not that big of a deal. No, you cannot do that. If you have adulterated product, it is adulterated, and it means it's unfit for human consumption, period.
Yeah. That's, I think it's a great point, because it's, if it's there, it's there. Now you got to make a decision on what you're going to do with it, how you're going to find it, or if you can find it, and then make a risk-based decision based on that.
Yeah, and that risk-based decision is really important. As we were preparing for this chat earlier this week, we were talking about this validation piece of it, and the analogy that came to mind for me, Kurt, was ATP.
Mm-hmm.
So when ATP testing first came out, it was, this is going to be the next great thing. It's going to be absolutely amazing. You'll be able to swab a surface and tell exactly how many bacteria are living there and act accordingly. Well, no, you can't. The ATP is a byproduct, and people have tried now for decades to correlate those numbers, and it doesn't match up. That's fine. Everybody's discarded that. But the point of this with the ATP side of it is you use ATP in a validation process in your facility, and you have different sites that you're sampling for ATP, residue ATP, as an indicator of cleanliness. And you'll swab a surface and you'll get a number, and you'll swab another surface and you'll get a different number, but they're still okay. Why? Well, it's because the different matrices, you're going to have higher ATP counts on a porous. So think like one of those god awful cloth belts that they used to have in machines.
Yeah.
High count.
Yeah.
Stainless steel surfaces that are not pitted and damaged, you're going to get a low count.
Yeah.
Rubber surfaces, you're going to get a higher count. You need to understand those baselines. And it's the same with your risk assessment with your foreign material. Certain things are going to have a higher propensity to put foreign material into your chain. And you need to understand what those are and take actions with your PM programs to change those parts out before they become catastrophic.
Absolutely. The PM is so key. And you've alluded to this a couple of times, but it's not just the early PM process, but it's the daily maintenance process of going through the checklist and making sure that all the equipment's where it's supposed to be, all the bolts, gaskets, everything that's supposed to be there is where it's supposed to be. Because it's not, it's easy to miss some of these things if you don't have a really diligent maintenance crew going through the checklist. One of the more common ones that we've seen, we've talked about gaskets quite a bit, but sometimes it's the pieces of a conveyor belt. Conveyor belts they'll become brittle over time, or they'll break off over time. And so where's the piece of the conveyor belt? Maybe you find part of it laying on the floor, but you don't find all of it laying on the floor. So where's the rest of it? And to your point, really when you're looking at some types of products, whether they're slicer blades or augers and those kind of things, those things start to deteriorate over time as well. And so if you start to see, things that have, where those things aren't where they're supposed to be, or they've started to break down, and they're looking like they're starting to be chips off of them and those kind of things. It's just so important to stay on top of those kind of things.
Exactly. And another area we didn't talk about, and this is a big enough concern that it's actually called out in the different standards, is emergency repairs.
Yeah.
That's a huge opportunity for foreign material. So your packaging line shuts down, products backing up, things are going on the floor, whatever. And the maintenance guys are rushing out there to fix that piece of machinery, and they got all their tools and bolts and everything else, and they're working like crazy to get this thing going. You have to pause at the end and say, okay, do I have my screwdriver? Yes. Do I have my hammer? Yes. Do I have my wedding ring? Well, why am I wearing a wedding ring anyway?
Yeah.
All right, no wedding ring.
Yeah.
All these is everything there and accounted for, including the parts that were repaired on the machine and the replacement parts. Is everything ready to go? Somebody needs to check that off, fresh set of eyes, and say, yep, we're good to go. I give authorization to restart the line.
Yep. All the nuts, bolts, washers, screws, everything that was used, you went in with a certain number, you're coming out with a certain number. You got to know what that is.
Exactly. And it's worth reemphasizing as well, guys, is that the highest times of risk in your production facility for the things that we're talking about today are exactly at your highest stress levels. So the chances of something failing are during your peak season. It's when you're rushing to get those Christmas orders out. It's when you're way behind on orders and you're cutting down sanitation time to try and get the orders out the door. Everybody is stressed. Everybody is just going, I just want to get through this. Can we just please finish making this stuff? And that's when you need to be on your highest guard, because that's when the problems happen.
Yeah, and to that point, there are seasonal effects with foreign materials, just like there are with some kind of microbiological concerns, depending on what's going on. And we know that, and some people look at this and they're like, no, there's really no way. But we know, and I think a beef manufacturer will tell you this, that during dove hunting season, or during when it's time for to get the cattle ready for slaughter, the propensity for buckshot to be in beef is much higher than it is in other times of the year. Well, there's a reason for it. It is because shotguns are being used around the farms, and so and that's just one example, and it's I don't want to say it's funny, but it's one that I never thought of until I got in the business I'm in now. But there are other things that are like that. It's seasonal. When you start to harvest different products, what are the other products that are being harvested at the same time that might introduce a foreign material into the product? And so it's important as part of the process and part of your evaluation of what's going on from your foreign material program, to make sure that your employees understand that, hey, we're running into this part of the season, and we typically during this part of the season we'll see some of these kind of things going on.
Exactly. So when I worked for a company that dealt more with commodity type products, and we would get rail cars of raw material in, and it would drop through the bottom of the rail car, and you would have the magnetic grates that it would go through. My team would keep track of what was found on those grates. And we would track through the course of the year, to your point, Kurt, we would track what are the high points for foreign material in those bulk shipments. And we then got a pretty good idea of what was expected and what was atypical. And if we saw a really high burden of material on those magnetic grates or screens, then we would have a talk with that supplier and say, hey, what's going on? And to try and figure out what was up. So really, and a big piece of this that I definitely want to get in here before we end the conversation to kind of bring this together is you need to look at this in terms of putting together your responses before you need them. And I refer to this as hand wringing. If you try and address corrective actions, disposition, all these type of activities from a food safety standpoint during a crisis, you're going to get pushed in a direction most likely that you do not like. You need to agree with your company in advance. It's like, okay, I'm in charge of food safety for the company. Foreign material is a huge issue that we're looking at. Let's all agree in advance what we are going to do as a company if we find foreign material. It's much easier to have a rational, calm discussion when there's no emergency. When there's an emergency, shit changes really fast. And if you have those agreements in place before the crisis, your life is a lot easier, because now you can go back with the company and discuss the issue and work with your experts on the outside to say, okay, here's our course of action. We're going to execute against this. And if people push against that, you have a very strong defense against that activity.
Yeah. And as part of that, I think companies, one of the things that we work with customers on a lot is, you're looking at, what is the opportunity to potentially rework product in-house or internally, utilizing your inline X-ray machines, versus utilizing a third party such as FlexXray.
Yeah.
And, what we have found is the companies that have done those evaluations, to your point, have looked at it very closely and have said, we can potentially rerun some of this or rework some of this stuff internally. To do so, we're either going to have to shut down a line, or we're going to have to bring people in on Saturday and run a line. And now we've missed machine time where we could be manufacturing product. When you get over a certain volume, and I think it probably is different from one SKU to the next. So I won't get into what the numbers might be, but when you get over a certain number, the cost of trying to rework, when you start looking at machine time and labor time and everything associated with it versus sending it out and the ROI on that, it becomes pretty evident pretty quickly. And what we have found is customers that do those type of calculations up front and do a lot of the evaluation up front and have an understanding of a ballpark for what it's going to be from a cost standpoint to outsource this work, tend to be somewhat routine in outsourcing work. Because it's not going to, when I say somewhat routine, it's very much somewhat, because it's based on the fact that they have a challenge or they have an issue. It's not just a routine thing, but they understand that, hey, there are a lot of variables that go into trying to totally rework this thing in house. We can get on a truck and get it out to FlexXray, and it doesn't take, and the ROI on this thing is pretty doggone big. And
Right.
So I think it's part of that evaluation. It's not just what is the process, but to your point, what are we going to do when it happens? Do you build this portfolio up front, then you make the decision to do this? If it's below a certain amount, do we try to rework it? A lot of variables, but I think to your point, it's really key to talk about those things up front and have an idea of what's going on.
Yep. Very well said. Build your playbook, right? So if you're watching a football game, the coaches aren't just winging it. They have that book that they're going through and saying, in this situation, here's how we respond. You need to do the same. That's how you win in these type of scenarios. And any closing thoughts, Kurt, for our audience today?
No, it's I appreciate the opportunity to be on this conversation. One of the questions that we often get asked, or a couple of questions, and I'll try to speak to that here with the audience, is when are you going to get close to being out further west? We're going to be on the West Coast, because we know that one of the variables that folks have to consider when they utilize a service like ours is how long it takes to get product, or how long it takes to get a truck to where you're going. So I did want to let you and the audience know we're in the process right now of building out a new facility right outside of Vegas. We should be open and operating in that facility around the end of June. So we'll be much closer to the marketplace out there, and it makes it simpler to do business. Nice. And one of the other questions that we get a lot is in terms of what's going on with new technology, what's happening with the technology and what's going on out there. And and there was a question here earlier, I think it was from Cortland, around AI, and AI is going to be a big player in X-ray technology and foreign material contamination as we move forward. But there are some other things that are going on out there and different types of systems to look at, and we'll continue to work with folks like Brian and others to keep you aware of what's out there, because we understand that it's important to be able to find as much stuff as you guys can find. And right now we know that there's some limitations for what's out there from a technology standpoint. But we'll continue to work with the industry to make sure we're looking at the newest and greatest technologies.
Yep. So perfect summary. And I think, so foreign material a lot of times gets overlooked, right? And you need to pay attention to this to prevent it. So as I promised you, let me put here in the comments. And so Duncan thinks I'm being very generous to coaches. Here's the link to the webinar that we did with FlexXray. last week, which is an amazing one. I'm also going to post all this information, all the different resources I found for this in our locals group. And again, guys, this is free. And here is the link to the locals group. You can join that, and I'll be posting that information in here later today. So with that, everybody, fantastic chat. Tons of information. Thank you, Kurt. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you. I mean, yeah, everybody in the audience, this is what makes this so much fun, is the interaction and being able once a week to sit down and hopefully improve everybody's food safety knowledge. I know that every week I do this, I always come away with new information, and it's part of what we need to do in food safety, because we have to be continuously growing. If you're not, you're going to be degrading. So don't get stuck in that trap. So with that, we'll bring our chat to a close here for this week. And of course, we'll be back here next week at the same time. So 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern. We live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So whatever resource you prefer, we're glad to have you here. So in the meantime, you've done a great job this week, and we really appreciate it. So thank you. Enjoy your weekend. Have a great one. You too, Kurt. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy it, and we'll see you here.
Thank you all. We appreciate it. Bye-bye.